So welcome to our webinar on how to qualify for Kona. I know that some coaches reached out and said that a lot of athletes are pumped about this one, and just in conversations with athletes, next year is going to be a year where many athletes who are really strong are going to move up in distance and try to do well at the Ironman distance. For some reason, many of the athletes we work with who are sort of at the pointy end now, they focus on 70.3 or they're pros. And next year it seems like there's going to be a shift, and many athletes are wondering kind of what it takes to qualify for the world champs. And uh, it's it's an initiative of ours to try to get as many athletes as we can to the next Kona. I know that the women are racing next, and then in 2026 is the next men's race, and I think it would be great. I think it's possible to get 20 working triathletes there, and we can kind of break it down a little bit, and um, so that everybody can understand what it takes to qualify, how to think about qualifying, how to select races, and how to live a lifestyle that is conducive to qualifying for Kona. Um, so feel free to stop me at any point or offer, some insight or your 2 cents on anything. Obviously, this is a conversation, and we want everybody to understand, um, you know, what it takes to qualify. So it is a little bit more difficult to qualify for Kona right now than Nice because the field is smaller. So at Nice, the capacity is larger, and we're kind of seeing about 60 slots per gender for Nice, and then really 35 to 40 slots for Kona. That means that if we're going off of this 35 to 40 slot range, the bigger age groups, they're going to have five or six, maybe up to seven slots. The smaller age groups will have one or two. This is the slot distribution at Ironman Wisconsin a couple months ago, and this is for the women because they had 35 slots. So you can kind of see here the distribution. So if you're in 50 to 54, there might be four or five slots, and maybe they don't roll down, maybe they do. You definitely, to guarantee a slot or to make it, pretty likely, ideally you get top five in your age group. Um, and the difficulty of achieving that sort of depends on the race and who shows up. And we can't predict that. So that's why when we talk about outcome goals, we don't really want to put all of our eggs in the outcome goal basket. It depends who shows up. So you can be really fit, but then if the top five athletes in the country in your age group show up to the race you're targeting, it's going to be particularly difficult. Um,
And we don't have OBS try to compare results anymore, where that database was really productive of coming through all results and had a ranking system, which was incredibly accurate. But unfortunately, Ironman doesn't share the data anymore. But yeah, so like Conrad said, like we don't know who's gonna show up until really you pull up the tracker the race weekend.
right. Um, and as a rule of thumb, and it's sort of like the age groups where like the bell curve is. So, in the faster age groups, say for women, the last qualifier is usually upper tens or sort of low 11s. For men, last qualifier is usually mid nines. To feel confident, obviously, if you're a guy, if you're sub nine, the balance of probability is you will qualify in the fastest age groups. So say 30 to 40, 25 to 40, or even 45. Um, for women, if you can break 11 hours, there's a really good chance that you'll qualify. But this is the average Kona qualification time by age group. This isn't exact. So this was just extrapolated from endurancedata.com, but just based on experience, this is pretty darn close. And keep in mind that honestly, most Ironman courses are fairly fast. So the qualification for Chattanooga, for example, which is not a particularly easy course, it might be slower than this, but you have the swim. Wisconsin is a challenging course, so it's going to be slower than this. I would say that probably, Florida might be a good example of a course that reflects these times, but you can kind of see on the men's side, ideally your low nines if you're in that 30 to 34 age group or 35 to 39. Again, there will be a couple of guys slower than this, a couple of guys faster. And as we move along the age range, that x-axis, obviously it gets slower, from 45. This is when there's a steeper decay in qualifying times. Part of that is because, um, oftentimes here there are actually more participants, so there are more slots, so it can be easier to qualify. But also, I mean, you can kind of see people start slowing down. They have kids, they have other responsibilities, they deal with injury, etc. Just normal aging, reduced aerobic capacity. But I mean, you can kind of see, I mean, athletes, you can still do quite well. Um, it's use it or lose it. And you can kind of see in that 50 to 54 age group, if you're in the tens, mid tens, there's a really good shot that you can qualify. 40 to 44, it's still really competitive. 45 to 49, ideally you're breaking that 10-hour range on a pretty flat course. For women, basically add an hour or so. Assume it's about 10% slower for women versus men. Um, and for women, it's easier to qualify for Kona than ever before because it's separated by sex now each year. A lot of times the number of slots allocated to women was reduced because men composed the preponderance of the field. So most slots would be allocated to the men's field because there were just more men there. But now it's just, single day events, one single sex on each day. Therefore, um, it's a little bit easier for women now. But it's still ain't easy. Here's Wisconsin. You can kind of see in you know, the last qualifier in the female 30 to 34, it was 11:09. Um, so you can kind of see you really have to be sub 12 to have a shot. And ideally, you kind of have to be ideally sub 11, but if you're in the 11s, you have a good shot if you're a woman. Again, for men up until about 50, you really have to be sub 10. Um, so when we break that down, what does that mean?
Yeah,
And I would consider this as par. So, a 60 to 65-minute swim, a 5-hour bike, and a 3:15 to 3:30 run for those younger age groups. That will return a time in the low to mid nines, depending on transitions. Obviously, if you're weak in one of these areas and strong in another, you can kind of, tweak it a little bit. Um, I've seen athletes swim 80 minutes and still qualify because they rode sub 5 and they ran close to 3 flat. Obviously, I mean, that's a massive difference. But most athletes are going to be in sort of this range. For women, 65 to 70, 5.5 hours, 5:45. That'll return to time in the low to mid tens. But when we think about it even further, because we see these times, but it's like, okay, what does that mean? For men, that means swimming 125 to 135 per 100 meters. So, if we think about it in terms of 100 yards, add 8 seconds or so. So basically 133 to 140 pace per 100 yards can kind of get you sub 70 here. 22 miles an hour will put you near that 5-hour bike. 7.5 to 8-minute miles will put you in that 3:15 to 3:30 range. And then for women, kind of they're able to go a little bit slower and still have a good chance of qualifying. So 20 miles an hour, sort of like low to mid eights. But many athletes, and depending on the day, you can run slower. On harder courses or on hot days, you can go slower. But that's generally the sort of the ballpark. Um, and then we break it down even further. Okay, we have the sort of the performance required on race day. What does this mean from a fitness perspective? So critical power or FTP, anaerobic threshold, whatever you want to call it. You Most athletes, the vast majority of men, are going to have a critical power above 4 watts per kilogram. So if you weigh 70 kilograms, which is what is that, like 160 pounds, 155 or so, uh, that times four is 280 watts. So you want an FTP or critical power around 280 at least, to be able to hold, reasonably hold, say 220 watts during the race, or, you know, if it's actually 280, it's probably gonna, you could probably maybe 220 is probably a little hot. So ideally, it's 4.5 watts per kilo. But if you're efficient, you can certainly qualify with around an FTP of 4 watts per kilogram. For women, we want to target 3.5 watts per kilogram is the sort of the key performance indicator we're looking for. And you need to average about 160 to 170 watts during the race to go 20 miles an hour if that's the case. Obviously, if somebody's lighter, this power target range you can reduce it. If somebody's really aerodynamic, it can be lower. But this just kind of puts into perspective what it's going to take. Um, for the swim, you're going to need a critical swim speed, pretty close to 120 per 100 yards. That'll kind of put you around 60 minutes for the swim. So you should be able to swim 1,000 yards, say, at 120 pace to be able to swim around an hour. But again, you can swim 65 minutes or 70 minutes. You can bike faster and run faster. Does anybody have any questions or thoughts on this?
I think we're going to talk about like course selection, but if you just like compare some of the flatter bike courses to some of the hillier bike courses, like that's where just being really strategic about like where your strengths lie and like that 5 hour bike split for men isn't always necessarily like going to be fast enough. And there are times when it might be like even slightly slower than that that you could. I mean, 5 hours is definitely something to shoot for. But I mean, if you look at Ironman Florida, some of those like bike splits are much faster than 5 hours, just because it's flat.
Right. I think Nick, he was in the 30 to 34 age group. He got fifth. I think he got fifth in his age group at Florida, I want to say fourth or fifth. And he rode 440. He swam 55 minutes, biked right around 440, and then ran, you know, mid 320s. And that probably would have qualified him on the day, but barely. Whereas
Was
Lake
that
Placid, Nick
was he?
Lorenzi,
Yeah, was he? I mean, do you think his power output was somewhere around that 220 watt range, or was it a little higher than that?
it was right there.
Yeah, yeah.
Um,
So you just go that
Flat
much faster on
course.
a flat course like that. Yeah.
You can go a lot faster. Yeah, he was right around there. His CDA is very good. We'll talk about how to achieve at this point, for example, a professional bike fit isn't really negotiable. You just need it. You think about super shoes, like you have to be dialed in because everybody else is dialing in their equipment and the marginal gains matter. And he's a good example of somebody who was able to bike very, very fast on, right around 220 watts and paying attention to the little things when it comes to equipment selection, bike fit. It pays off on race days because it reduces that CDA or the drag that you accumulate on the bike. And for the run, so the run is becoming more and more important in Ironman racing, in triathlon in general. And, it's sometimes we hear 3.5 hours or 3 hours, 45 minutes, and maybe it doesn't sound that difficult. I mean, it's moving for sure, but what does that mean from a fitness perspective? So, I like this chart a lot because it just kind of demonstrates what you need. So this column here, it basically is your threshold pace. So call it the pace you could hold for, 45, maybe 60 minutes all out. Um, and it's basically between 10K and half marathon pace. So to run a 3:15, ideally your threshold is 5:45 per mile. You can kind of see that if your threshold pace is 5:45, then it's reasonable to expect a marathon in the 3:08 to 3:21 range. The faster we go on this chart, you can kind of lean towards the 80%. So really 5:45, I would say that somebody who's like decently durable should be able to run actually pretty close to 3:08. The slower we get, I would probably I would lean closer to the slower end of the range. So if somebody's threshold is 7:36, I might expect them to run closer to really 5:29 than 4:12. If they're super durable, maybe they can hold 4:12, but it's a little bit tougher. To run a 3:30, your threshold needs to be in that 6:15 range. To run 3:45, it needs to be in that 6:38 range. So we think about a 4 hour marathon, the slowest threshold you could basically have is probably around 7 minutes, 20 seconds per mile. So, if you can if in training you can show up to the track and hold 7 minutes, 20 seconds per mile for 30 minutes, we would expect you to run sort of in that 4 to 4:20 range. If you can show up to the track by yourself and run 5:45 miles for 30 minutes, again, by yourself, you could probably run in that 3:08 to 3:20 range. If somebody could do that, I would be targeting more closer to like 3:09 to 3:15, probably. It depends on durability, depends what training demonstrates, etc. So, this is a handy chart, puts everything into perspective on how you need to think about kind of what targets you need to hit to be able to run, a 4 hour marathon or a 3.5 hour marathon at the end of an Ironman. Do
Probably
any
worth
coach?
noting that the weather plays a factor in this too. Obviously, like when people are testing, generally it's in ideal conditions. When you go to the course, even Florida, even though it's in November, it can be pretty warm. But so the pace is maybe a little bit slower, but it'd be slower for the whole field as well.
Hmm. That's right. And, I will say I've definitely coached athletes who their thresholds were, closer to probably 6:30, and they were able to run. Well, actually, here, I think of one athlete in particular, he ran low 3:30s and his threshold was right around 6.5 minutes. So depending on the athlete, they can be in the faster end of this range, but you have to adjust for conditions like Derek is talking about. Lake Placid, the times are going to be a little bit slower. It's going to like this is think about this chart as being useful for flat races, flat, cool races, which is generally when we test in those conditions to establish run threshold pace, that is. Coaches, do you do you think this chart is accurate? Have you found these numbers to be correct, more or less?
Wait, say it one more time.
Do you find this chart to be pretty accurate?
I think so. Yeah, looking at like I mean, I haven't done a full in a while, but the half marathon splits line up pretty well.
Yeah. Basically, it's 75 to 80% of threshold velocity for an Ironman and 90 to 95% of threshold velocity for a half Ironman. So this is when we're in training peaks, when we're building targets, this is par. This is a good rule of thumb. So that's why, this chart is accurate and it's useful.
Yeah, and I think that this just like further accentuates like this chart specifically having like 75% of your functional threshold pace or like that range of 75 to 80. It just really accentuates the difference between running a marathon coming off the bike in an Ironman and like what you might target like just in an open marathon. Like if somebody's got a threshold pace at 5:45, like they're not looking to run a 3:15 marathon just like in an open marathon. They're much faster than that. So it just like really highlights that
Right.
the run in an Ironman is like essentially a zone two effort, and you just have to be efficient enough to run zone two at the paces that we're talking about. Like to run that like 3:15 to 3:30 marathon. If you're talking about an evenly balanced race, it's 60 to 65 minutes, 5 hours, and then 3:20 off the bike.
That's a really good point. Yeah, I mean somebody running a 3:08 to 3:20 marathon at the end of an Ironman is going to be able to run 1:15 for a half or 1:16 if we want to round up. Like that's moving. The equivalent of a 6:20 5K. That's quick. Um, there people have different metabolic profiles. There are certainly athletes who can run 3:10 who there's no way they'd be able to run 16:20 and vice versa. But when we move into that race specific block, we're kind of building efficiency to do this. And you might lose the ability to run a fast 5K, but not really. Usually, when athletes toe the line in an Ironman, especially age groupers, they're probably going to be in the best shape of their life for everything. Just because it's such it requires a lot of training load and volume, and fitness is fitness for the most part at the end of the day. So,
Georgie just asked a question, just like if it's common for pros to run off the bike in zone three for the marathon, and I think that just like goes into the point that Conrad made earlier, where the faster that you're going for the marathon distance, the higher like percentage of your functional threshold pace and like higher heart rate zone you can hold for that period of time. And also taking into account the fact that you've like maybe been on the course for 5.5 hours instead of 6.5 or 7 hours at that point. And so just thinking metabolically that like if you're running a 2 hour 40-minute marathon off the bike, that's way less time that you're going to be spending at that elevated heart rate and at that higher percentage of your functional threshold pace than if you're running a 3 hour and 45-minute marathon off the bike. So the percentage of what people are capable of holding when you get into that more elite marathon or even elite half coming off the bike, people are holding a much higher percentage of that like of that functional threshold pace and like the discrepancy between what they can run in an open full and what they're running off the bike. Same with like, and it's getting even closer for the half distance where like people are running closer and closer to what they really could run in an open half off the bike when we're talking about
mhm.
the elite athletes. But yeah, I mean, they're the pros are definitely holding a higher percentage of their functional threshold pace when they're the ones that are running in that like 235 to 245 range than people that are running 3:15 or 3:30 coming off the bike.
Yeah, that's a good question. And I will say that the pros, they're holding zone three for an Ironman for sure. Um, Age groupers, we're in that sort of like zone two range. And this comes back to, like Derek said, time of that they're moving and also durability. And durability, you kind of forge that in training through volume, and just training consistently over time. You can hold a higher percentage of threshold for longer. So when we think about this for age group athletes, what kind of training are we talking about here to achieve this? Obviously, this allocation depends on the athlete, but rarely is there an athlete who qualifies for Kona, who's not swimming 10 to 20K per week, cycling 7 to 12 hours per week, and running, call it really like 4 to 7. 7 is high. That's probably the exception on this chart for age group athletes, but 4.5 to 5.5 is probably a more reasonable tight range here. Um, a minimum 30 miles, but I would say 35 to 40 is more of kind of like a par minimum. Um, so it's a lot of training. And even on the lower end, think about, 7 plus 4.5 hours, you're at 11.5 hours of cycling and running. And that's on the low end. I would say that most athletes probably couldn't qualify with that type of volume for bike and run, and then layer on the swim, another 3 hours, you're already pretty close to 15. I think that's 14 and a half. So it everybody's gonna sort of require a different approach. And it isn't like you assemble 3 months of this type of training together and you can qualify. Obviously, this type of training over time is what it's going to take, plus the ability to recover from it, plus good body composition. Um, so, we can talk about body composition a little bit later, but um, well, maybe let's just talk about it now, then we can go back to nutrition. But it matters a lot, because it'll help you recover better, hormones will be better. You need appropriate body composition. You can't carry too much body fat. You also can't carry too little because then you won't be able to recover from the sessions. So, I mean, the fact is, and I always want to be cautious whenever I talk about body composition with endurance athletes because there's a huge prevalence of eating disorders and energy deficiency among endurance athletes. So before I even dig in a little bit, it's better to be strong and carry a little bit more weight than weak and just injured all the time. So especially when you're training at a high level, you can't be in a major calorie deficit at all. Ideally in the main, race build where volume is really high, ideally we don't have any deficit. So for men, very few athletes are qualifying if their body fat is over 15%. Most are in that 12% range. For women, it's higher than that, um, just due to just genetically what's going on there. But in general, to qualify, it's a low bar, but you have to be leaner and stronger than the average American, obviously. Um, so many athletes to really get to a body composition that will maximize the likelihood of qualifying, it is important to kind of cut out junk, cut out alcohol, make sure you're fueling with really good, nutritious food. You need an adequate, distribution of macronutrients. So, typically that when we're training, the thing that we're gonna have to eat more of is carbohydrates. So a typical one, probably about 65 to 70% of calories each day are coming from carbohydrates, and then, call it 15 to 20% are coming from protein and fat. Um, and carbohydrates increases just because the when you're training, that's what you need more of. Um, so you need to ensure that you're eating well. So using MyFitnessPal, tracking your diet for a week or two can be good to kind of help you dial in what you need to be eating. But when you're burning 4,000 calories a day, you have to eat, and you have to eat a lot. And one thing that holds, I believe, many athletes back is a lack of sufficient calories when you're training like this, especially a lack of protein. Um, I'm an advocate of targeting zero point 0.8 to 1 gram of protein per pound of body weight. And that doesn't just happen. You kind of have to work at it and deliberately choose, food that's high in protein. It's easy to get enough fat. Obviously oils, olive oils, fat is in many things, and it's easy to get, an appropriate amount of fat. But protein is where you kind of have to be more deliberate, and because that's going to be repairing those muscles. I mean, we'll talk about recovery later, but you won't be able to recover if you're not replacing what you're eating in the right way. So it's junk in, junk out. Obviously, when you're burning 4,000 calories a day, you do need to sometimes it's okay to eat empty calories. It's okay to eat junk food, but we don't want you just eating a bunch of junk and not getting in those important nutrients that you need, like the vitamins and minerals that you need. Um, so it's not just all about macros, although macronutrients are, yeah, it's good to track those, but we also want to focus on, the vitamins and minerals and eating healthy food. Um, so if you break it down, if you're training about 18 hours a week, that's an extra, call it 13,000 calories per week or an extra around 2,000 a day, 1850 to 2,000 a day. So easily you're going to need about 4,000 calories a day. If you're a smaller athlete training at a lower power output, that's reduced. If you're a bigger athlete training at a higher power output, you're burning more calories when you're training. So it's going to be on the higher end of this or more than this. So diet becomes pretty darn important. I think that there are very few athletes qualifying for Kona who are not being deliberate and careful to eat healthy and eat a lot. Does anybody have any thoughts on this?
I'd just like to add that th this feels like a really timely like conversation to be having for a variety of reasons, and this is one of them. That like if people feel like their body composition and just dialing in nutrition is something that will support them performing well in a race and getting a Kona qualification, like now is the time to do that because of exactly what Conrad said. You don't want to be like in a deficit, losing weight in the lead up to your race, like 12 weeks out from a race, that like I have seen countless times, like athletes come to me for coaching that are interested in losing weight while they're training. And that is like, I always say, like at best counterproductive and at worst dangerous. And so just like now is the time to like during the off season, if training volume is a little bit lower, intensity is a little lower, like now is the time when you can really be dialing in body composition so that you're able to eat like in maintenance or even slightly above maintenance when you're training really hard next spring, summer, leading into the fall for whatever races you're targeting. So yeah, just an important thing to call out.
Well, one of the
Yeah.
easiest things to do too is like Conrad had on there is the alcohol consumption. If people cut that out, like it's empty calories and you generally are going to eat less junk food when you're drinking as well. So like if the goal is to qualify and you're really focused in on that, that's going to be an easy way to remove unneeded calories and obviously add overall health across the board.
Right. And I mean, some of the reasons for that, if you're having a couple drinks a week, it's probably not going to make a massive difference. But most people aren't having a couple drinks. Most people are having a couple a day. And the reason that the problem with it is it prevents your body from recovering. It's going to hurt body composition because it inhibits muscle protein synthesis. You're not going to sleep as well. It increases cortisol levels and it reduces testosterone. So it has a catabolic impact. So it's going to prevent you from recovering. It's going to have the opposite effect that we want. So I just I bring this up just because I know specific instances of athletes who would be just monsters, just aerobic monsters, and be able to crush it if they didn't, drink 12 IPAs a week. Because if you just break it down, say an IPA, say a pint is 200 calories, even if you have two a week, or two a day, that's an extra 400 calories a day. That's 2,800 calories. So every 10 days, that's worth a pound of body fat. Multiply that in a month, that's 4 pounds. So you can kind of see how it adds up quickly. Um, but even the calories are almost secondary to the other negative impacts. Um, so moderation, not going to be a big deal, but most people maybe they think they're drinking moderately, but they're not. So just be careful with that. That's just such an easy lever to pull that can transform your body comp. Um, so that's a good segue to bringing up lifestyle in general. And the, you have to kind of meet the challenge, and it's not easy to KQ. You're just think about who you're competing against. Think about a triathlon like transition and picture who's there. It's it is many of them are ambitious, kind of type A athletes, and a good percentage of them want to qualify for Kona. On any given day, probably 20 to 30 people in each age group are going to show up, and they're thinking that, they have a shot at it. So how are you going to be an outlier and be, in that, say, that top five or top eight or top three to that in your age group, which is what it's going to take to qualify? I mean, you have to walk the walk, basically. So recovery is just not negotiable. And, physical and mental rest is essential. Sleep is most important. I'm not sure I've worked with anybody who has qualified on less than 8 hours o- of sleep a night. Most are honestly 9 to 10. And that requires discipline, that requires structuring your day in a manner that, you know, makes it easy for you to go to bed at the same time every day. Um, and when you're training like this, obviously your life is gonna a big percentage of your focus during your waking hours is gonna kind of revolve around this. Not just when you're training, but also when you're not training, because you want to minimize stress otherwise and try to get that parasympathetic flow going. So things like meditation, deep rest, trying to manage your emotions and stress levels, that is going to help you recover better. Um, so a question that kind of has to come up is, what are you going to cut out? Like, what are you going to deliberately not do that will enable you to recover so that you absorb the training and reach a level of fitness that enables you to qualify for Kona. So, we already kind of talked about alcohol, reducing or eliminating alcohol. Um, you might have to cut out just going out and, well, drinking with that group of friends. But it's also like the little things that add up. Are you like, there's a time to be appropriately obsessed when you're not obsessed, but committed when you're up in that race specific build, say, and you're probably going to have to reduce the peripheral activities that you engage in that physically exhaust you. It's just an unfortunate reality, or maybe it's not unfortunate. Maybe you can give yourself permission to reduce your stress levels. Because I think all of us think, okay, I need to be dialed in. I need to be, super focused and stressed out, or a low level of just anxiety is good because it helps me perform. It's like, that's not necessarily the case. You can perform at work and not be just functioning and anxious all the time. So making a deliberate effort to do things that enable you to relax and manage stress is helpful. Get your family on board, get your spouse to communicate with your spouse on a daily structure that works for them so you can be present when you need to be. The vast majority of athletes I work with who reach a high level, who have family, they wake up really early and they get it done. I know, one athlete, he wakes up at 4 a.m. every day and he gets training done before 7 every day. And he is able to pull it off and qualify for multiple world champs, go mid nines in an older age group to qualify. But he's able to show up for the family, and obviously if you can do that, it'd probably be the case that your spouse will support you better if you don't have training overtake your life. But you need to structure your day in a manner that enables you to get the work done. And again, usually that means getting it done early. Um, And then again, I talk about parasympathetic activation. So things like, again, meditation, just rest, reading. You have your sympathetic drive, which is sort of like fight or flight. And that's when your heart rate goes up. If you're stressed out, your sympathetic nervous system is sort of taking over. Parasympathetic nervous system, that's the rest and digest mode. If you're not training, you want to be in the rest and digest mode to the extent possible. And your ability to do this will make a huge difference. Um, so work on this. I know that this is sort of a separate from training, but recovery is as important as the training itself. But I do think that getting family on board and understanding the initiative, having a timeline for it is helpful. Um, and I would say that's important. I know many times Ironman is called like basically the widowmaker hobby because if it overtakes your life too much and you're not deliberately getting training done in time slots that make the most sense for, everything else going on in your life, spouse can kind of get annoyed. So you want to avoid your spouse getting annoyed. So it makes it easier on you too. So does anybody have any thoughts on this, on sort of the lifestyle component of qualifying for Kona? Nope. Then we can move on to race selection. And Derek mentioned this earlier, but there are many variables that go into selecting the ideal race that will maximize the potential that you qualify. And number one is you got to find one that suits your strengths. If you're a horrendous swimmer, then pick a downstream swim. Pick California, pick Chattanooga, pick a race where you're reducing the likelihood that it's going to be a choppy, slow swim. Um, if you are a bigger athlete and you put out a lot of power, pick a flat course where watts to CDA matters more than watts to kilograms. If you're a big athlete and you put out a lot of power, pick Florida, pick California. Don't pick Lake Placid. If you're a smaller athlete who's, really a strong cyclist, Lake Placid can be the ticket because it's a really slow bike. Very few athletes break 5 hours there. And, the run is fairly challenging as well. Um, so, be smart there. We also want to think about temperature. Certain athletes do really well in the heat, others don't. So consider that. Um, Proximity to where you live can be helpful. I mean, it's much easier to just drive to a race than fly. I know, and certain athletes, flying is no big deal for them. Flying with their bike is no big deal. Other athletes, they just become riddled with anxiety. They're mortified to, disassemble their bike and assemble it when they get there. Be realistic with yourself. And sometimes the closest Ironman is the best because it reduces stress. Um, Regional championships have more slots. So in North America, Texas, Ironman Texas is the North American Championship. So they're right around double the number of slots. So historically, it can be easier to qualify at a regional championship, but even that isn't a guarantee because many athletes end up targeting that because there are more slots. But when I look at the data, it does seem like it's kind of a wash, maybe depends on the age group, but there usually are some roll downs there. I would not bank on, if we're thinking about qualifying for say, for Kona in 2026, if you're a male, uh, I don't think that Texas is going to be an easy place to qualify. So Texas 2026, I think, is going to be competitive because you have Spain, the world champs, in early November, and that interferes with the domestic Ironman races. So I think a bunch of athletes are going to kind of wait and try to qualify at Texas. So I don't think that Texas 2026 is going to be the easiest way to qualify for Kona 2026. I could be wrong. It's just there could be many athletes who are just not going to do Spain, or athletes who are going to do a September Ironman like Maryland or Chattanooga and then do Spain, a month and a half later. That I think that's going to happen. I think, it might be easier to qualify at, a fall Ironman though, compared to Texas, maybe. It might be a little bit easier than normal, if the World Champs was not in November, but um, you know, it's the problem. The thing is with Spain, it's going to make it pretty tough to do Spain and then roll around and do Arizona and or Florida. So it might be easier to qualify there than it normally is, but you know, I also think that those who want to qualify for Kona maybe don't care as much about Spain. So no matter what, it's going to be tough. But being strategic and thinking that through is helpful. It's also the case that you can have two shots at it. You do Maryland and Chattanooga, and maybe you can do Arizona, or maybe you can do Texas. So you want to think that through as well. So talk to your coach about what's best.
I'd like to add one more thing. I've been speculating a lot about like what races are going to like have more slot or like have a more competitive field than others. And again, this is all speculation, but the piece that Conrad's bringing up about Texas is that like at least my gut tells me that Texas is kind of the last place that people are interested, like in North America. It's like the last time when people are interested in like getting a slot. Like it's, they would prefer to go to Texas and get a slot in Texas than go to Lake Placid in July because Lake Placid is the final North American qualifying race for the same calendar year. And so doing Lake Placid in late July and then number one, turning around and doing another Ironman in October, but also number two, logistically planning a trip to Hawaii after like July and after everybody has already gotten their slots. All the Airbnbs are already like getting kind of full, all the hotels are kind of full. It's just like a way more logistically difficult race to plan for if you qualify in Lake Placid. So like I my like gut tells me that people are more likely to do what you're talking about, Conrad, where they'll do a fall race, maybe like September, do a fall race, or even potentially two fall races. And then if they still haven't gotten their slot, everybody that doesn't have their slot is going to be at Texas. And there are more slots available, but it's going to I just anticipate that being a really competitive field um,
Yeah.
in 2026. Yeah, that race.
The other thing too is like for people that live in the north or in colder climates, you don't want to be on your trainer all winter long training for
Yeah.
Texas in April. So I mean, it can be done for sure, absolutely, but the training might be less enjoyable when you're inside in a dark pain cave or in your basement for months on end.
Right. I agree. And one other option, one other thing I wanted to bring up, if you're more like, in this age group and you're more like here, you can, to maximize your chances of qualifying, you can go to different like overseas Ironmans, Ironman Malaysia, for example, where it's a little bit easier to qualify. Obviously, that carries its own expense and logistics, but I know that, one athlete I work with who is going to do Spain and also wants to qualify for Kona, is talking about doing Malaysia. So, you know, you can kind of do it that way and maybe counterintuitively. I know that in Europe, it's often said that it is the competition at the pointy end is more intense there. It's also the case that there are more roll downs, especially like Derek is mentioning with Lake Placid. It's late in the qualification cycle. Very few Europeans are going to show up to a European Ironman in late July and want to just Kona is farther away for them. So it's tougher for them to justify traveling to Kona. It's just way more work. And it that's another sort of backdoor way to qualify if you do a late season European race. I've seen some big roll downs there for Kona. Um, Anybody else have any thoughts about race selection or anything else so far? So the next thing, optimizing gear and equipment. So I know that, everybody's always says, fitness first. Don't worry about the deep wheels, the aero helmet. Just work on your engine. And to an extent, that is accurate because you need the engine. It's not negotiable. But at this point, nothing is really negotiable when it comes to optimizing gear, equipment, and position. So in the hierarchy of what we're talking about here, it's fit. So you definitely should get a professional bike fit by a fitter who knows his stuff and has a history of fitting some very, very, very good, fast athletes who have aerodynamic, comfortable positions. Um, so a good fitter is worth their weight in gold. Invest in a bike fit for sure. Um, but everything else is important as well. Making sure you have fast wheels, making sure that your front end is optimized and you're comfortable. Um, you need fast tires, either a good fast tubeless tire or a fast clincher with latex tubes. Get an aero helmet. Your tri-suit should be tight and, obviously still comfortable, but you need a tight one. You don't want anything flapping. It could cost you a couple minutes. That could be the difference between qualifying or not. Um, and you want to think about storage. What I'm getting at here is you need the storage on your bike to hold the fueling and hydration items that you're going to require when you're riding. So there is not a good quality sports drink on course anymore on the bike, for example. So, it's Mortal, which doesn't have any carbohydrate. Some Ironmans, they're having normal Gatorade, which is great. But most athletes who I'm working with now, we're going either concentrated bottle of pH or Tailwind or the pH flow gel and then just fluid. You can grab water at aid stations. That's easy. You can grab Mortal, which is a good way to get sodium, but you need a way to store basically a lot of calories. So whether that's gels, flow gel, um, or just another bottle. But internal storage is great. You'll probably notice that the trend, which I'm a big advocate of. I've been an advocate of this for years. I was never a fan of the straws coming up, and I don't really care about internal hydration for the bike. That's a contrarian perspective, but I'm an advocate of having bottles right here. And now it's really easy to get two bottles right here. And it's over the last 2 years, there's even more justification for this because it fills that gap. So it can actually enhance aerodynamics. So figure out how to get a bottle or two right in front of your chest. Um, was a Profile Design just came out with a pretty cool sort of BTA setup where you can put two bottles there. Behind the saddle is another great place. Um, I haven't been checking the chat here. I see some people have posted. If I miss anything, just I think Derek,
Yeah,
you.
we're kind of chatting about it, but we can.
Oh,
I'm
cool,
happy to bring
cool.
it
No,
up.
you're doing
I'm
good.
happy to bring it up.
Never mind, never mind. Okay. But yeah, so hydration matters. Carrying everything that you need in an aerodynamic manner is number one. So certainly talk to your coach about how to optimize everything. And they can give you ideas about which products to buy. So, obviously speak with them or post on Slack. I mean, Slack, we have a lot of um athletes who love optimizing their setup and who have tried every product available. And so Slack is a great resource because all the coaches are on there. Many athletes are on there who love to tinker and that offer great insight. Like this morning, I asked about the New Balance fuel cell. like the super shoes and the trainers, and it's like we have enough info in there to write a really good article. So it's real world experience with your peers. So feel free to get this discussions going on Slack too. Um, and then super shoes. Super shoes are faster for pretty much everybody. Um, so figure out a super shoe that you like. I think comfort matters. I like, I still go back to the Nike. I still think that I've tried a bunch. I like the Nikes, the Vaporfly and the Alpha Fly. Many athletes have liked the Meta Speeds. It seems like they're falling out of favor a little bit among athletes I work with. I think three athletes over the last 2 months kind of got a little bit frustrated with them. It's kind of messing up their feet a little bit, but many athletes love them. Saucony, uh the endorphins. I mean, obviously those are great. The elites work for some people, but um, it's worth trying a few and going with what you like. Um, so does anybody have any thoughts there? The one thing I would say about super shoes for Ironman races is that you need to be careful because you're running a marathon and you're running it essentially zone two. You're still going to run faster in super shoes, but you want to be careful with, arguably you want to be careful with some of the more minimal ones. I personally like the Alpha Fly. That's a little bit of a polarizing shoe. So to the extent you can experiment, do it. Um, Going a little bit more supportive is probably better for an Ironman marathon compared to, what you might run a sprint triathlon in. But all these little things matter. And nutrition is another piece. I mean, nutrition in general, whether it's on the bike or on the run, you need to practice it. You need to figure out a strategy that works really well for you. Obviously, many athletes are using precision fuel and hydration. That it's a pretty turnkey way to do it. Um, it's working for many athletes. It's great stuff. There's other great products out there. I still am a fan of Tailwind. There's other options out there. If you don't find that pH works for you or you like other stuff better, but to qualify for Kona, you need to dial this in. It isn't, you should not have the plan to just drink freely or ad lib or just have a general target. Like you need to understand down to the gram of carbohydrate what you're taking in. And if something goes wrong, you have to have the ability to improvise. So you need to understand how many Martin gels you're going to need to take on the run if you lose the nutrition that you brought, or just figure out how to use the course to its max potential. I'm an advocate of this. It's what I personally do. It's, in my next Ironman, I'm going to lean heavily into the Morton because it's there. And you have every mile, you have access to it. Make sure Mortal works for you. Experiment with Mortal hydration. Maybe it works for you. Maybe the stevia doesn't work for you. Um, Many athletes carry bottles, a hand bottle or a belt. And really, you just need to figure it out in training and then stick to the plan on race day, but still have the ability to listen to your body and improvise when necessary. Does anybody have any thoughts on optimizing gear and equipment?
There's one question in the chat from Casey just about super shoes, like whether or not you should really just wear them for race day or how often should you train in them. I mean, my opinion on this is I do think that it's best to like kind of save them for the most part for race day, but I know a lot of people like to do some of their key intensity runs, like to do some like race specific pace efforts in their super shoes like quite a handful of times in the lead up to a race, just so that they are familiar with them, know that they're not going to like create any hot spots on your feet. And I mean, like when it comes down to it, it also gives you a little bit of a perspective of like how much faster you're going to be moving for that same effort and at the same heart rate. So it just like gives you that perspective. So I know athletes that use it as like a bit of a motivator when they're like having a hard time, like thinking about that, like really hard key endurance run with some like harder efforts at the end. Like, is it cool if I wear my race shoes? And I'm like, yeah, go for it. Like, yeah, we'll give them permission to do that for sure if it's that thing that's going to get them out the door and like have them feel a little bit more like they're in the zone for race day. But I generally think that it's nice to only wear them, I don't know, like a half dozen times or so in the lead up to a race. But that's my personal perspective.
I agree. You definitely don't want to be running in them every day. And I'm not an advocate of athletes running in super shoes for easy runs or for every key intensity session. You use them up, but the issues are that they're a little bit less supportive. And many athletes who have done that, who I've worked with or I'm aware of, they experience some well injuries, especially post-tib. So posterior tibialis tendonitis is there's been an uptick in the prevalence of that since super shoes came out. And that leads to a collapsed arch. It's basically pain on the inside of your basically your leg, your ankle that goes down around your ankle bone into your foot. So, but an occasional speed session is okay. Definitely, the week before an Ironman, those speed sessions, it's just fun when you're in taper mode, throwing on the super shoes. It bolsters confidence, which makes a difference. Anybody have any other questions?
I have one more point that I'd like to add that just feels relevant coming out of the Ironman that I just did a few weeks ago. That is like, it just reiterated for me that like when it comes down to it, these races are still just a time trial. And so it's like it feels really hard at the end of an Ironman to just like know that a few seconds can count for a lot. But it is just really important that like the person that's running next to you might have started like 10 seconds ahead of you. And so crossing the finish line just behind them is like, it might not be the thing that's going to like, I don't know, like get that one extra spot for you. And so just like for context, I just looked at my age group, which is 35 to 39. It was not a very competitive age group at Arizona, but like the difference between fifth and sixth place was 3 seconds over 10 hours. We're talking the difference was 3 seconds. So like if there are five slots in that age group and they go to all top five people, like the difference between a Kona slot and not getting a Kona slot was 3 seconds. And then the difference between like eighth and 12th was like just under 2 minutes. So like, yeah, just like really, it's really, really important that you're like considering that in those final miles when it gets really hard and you're like, can I hold on to this pace? Can I pick it up just a little bit more? Like sprinting through the finish line, all of that, like it really is important because you don't want to like cross the finish line, realize you got third place, then like 10 minutes later, two guys cross the finish line ahead of you. You're not in third anymore. You're in fifth, and then you end up not getting a slot because you like took your time crossing the finish line in those like final like 1,500 meters or so, you know. So just an important thing to be considering is like when we're talking about the pointy end of the race, the difference is like very frequently like a few minutes and sometimes even a few seconds.
Yeah, that's a great point. Always be passing. Anybody else have any thoughts on qualifying for Kona, optimizing gear and equipment, or race tactics? I mean, race tactics might be a different webinar, actually. High level race tactics for long course racing. Um,
Josh, Josh asked a question in the chat that like Derek and I both sort of responded to, but I'm interested in your thoughts on Conrad is like someone doing two Ironman races in the fall of next year, like doing Maryland and then doing Florida, which are like separated by about 8 weeks or something like that, if I'm remembering correctly. So yeah, I mean, like my thoughts are that you're not really going to be any fitter for that race, so you're really just solving for like, is there going to be less competition at Florida? Like if Maryland was a particularly competitive race in your age group, you might be solving for a little bit like just different competition on the day. Or if a race doesn't really go 100% in your favor at a race like Maryland and you want to give it another shot, like that's when it like might make more sense. But you're not going to be really going into race day 2 months later, like with some different level of fitness that's going to allow you to go faster on in that second race than the first race, especially considering like the amount of recovery that's typically required for athletes when they do push themselves really hard for an
Right.
Ironman. But yeah, what are your thoughts?
I think that's correct. I think sometimes in certain instances, if an athlete overtrained into the first Ironman, sometimes that second one can you can actually see an improvement. But and also they have the experience of the race and they respect the race, or it's an experience and they can sort of leverage and solve or not repeat some of those mistakes that they made in the first Ironman. But you're right. I think that you're probably not going to gain fitness. I think 8 weeks, it really depends on how well you recover. Certain athletes, they bounce back from an Ironman really quickly. If that's the case, then 8 weeks is no problem. You have a down week of almost nothing. You have a week where it's just really light, and then you sort of have a 5 week build, say, and you can be ready certainly for an Ironman in that time period. I know Gonzalo, I think he was on this call, but he left, but he did that last year. His races were separated by 8 to 10 weeks, and he did Florida as the second race, and he did really well, had the best race of his life. So it's no problem if physically and mentally you're not burnt out. The issue is if you're mentally burnt out, it's going to be torture, and you're not going to want to do it, and that can impact consistency and honestly impact your ability to absorb the training if you're just more stressed out because of it. Um, so I think that for an experienced athlete who recovers well, that approach is reasonable if you want to increase the probability of qualifying for Kona, but you have to know what that means. Many times after an Ironman, athletes they just don't want to do anything for a month, and that's fine. Like that's reasonable. Other times, athletes 3 days after, they're like, "Oh my gosh, I want to recover as quickly as possible because I'm excited about the next thing." So know yourself, know how you're going to feel after training at a high load for months going into the first Ironman. But I think it's fine to do that. And it's you can also do something like a fall Ironman and then Texas. So, but having a couple shots is okay so long as an athlete is resilient. And I think most athletes who have the potential to qualify for Kona, they're probably the type of athlete that can have two shots at it, like Josh is talking about. What else? Any other thoughts or questions? So at the end of the day, we want to be careful with outcome goals like qualifying for Kona because certain factors are outside of our control on race day, and we don't want you devastated emotionally after a race if you don't qualify. So we need to be careful. It's a good sort of purpose or one of the purposes that can guide training and get you excited and foster consistency in training for an Ironman, having the goal of qualifying for Kona but it should not be the number one goal. It should be like the fourth or fifth goal. And you want to figure out how to enjoy the process. So set process goals, find intrinsic motivation and joy in training. I think it's going to be fun building for Ironmans next year because more athletes than normal are going to be targeting them. So hopefully, we have that Slack channel where it's the Kona Slack channel. Hopefully we can keep up chatter on there. Everybody can stay motivated and have fun in training. But again, don't be too emotionally attached to the idea of qualifying for Kona because it's hard to do it. Many things can go wrong. So we want to keep all of this in perspective. But that's the presentation. Does anybody have any thoughts or questions? What webinar would be useful, do you think, that would maybe help you if your goal is to qualify for Kona? Is there anything specifically that would interest you that we could cover? If
I
not,
think, I
oh, go
mean,
ahead.
in the like months leading into some of these bigger Ironman races, like doing an Ironman tactic strategy type webinar. Like we've done sort of 70.3 strategy type webinars in the past. So I think that
Yeah.
might just be helpful. Like, I mean, just thinking about even more like dealing with some kind of adversity or like, I don't know, losing a bottle or like, yeah, being
Mm,
able to solve for those kinds of things might also be just helpful information to consider. Um, and like to go in with a lot more um like ideas for how to solve for that. I mean, even me personally now, like I haven't touched Mortal and I haven't really planned to a whole lot, but I always knew what like my contingency plan on course
mhm.
was when Gatorade Endurance was there. I could tell you exactly how much sodium and how much carbs. But yeah, Mortal is not something that I have done a lot of contingency planning for. So like just thinking about that as well.
I love it. I agree. We should definitely do that. So we'll do that in a few months. Cool. Well, thanks for hopping on, everybody. Hopefully this was useful and keep the conversation going on Slack. But everybody have a good Thanksgiving and we'll see you soon. Hey, what's up? Hey, Sierra. See you guys.